All right, guys, we are back. And in this particular video, we are going to discuss the major difference between role-based access control and mandatory access control. So, classification. That is the major difference between role-based access control and mandatory access control. Okay, classification. Remember, mandatory access control is technically a higher level of scrutiny. It's the strictest of all levels with regards to access control. So if they ever ask you which access control is the safest, you can surely assume mandatory access control is the safest. However, remember, because it's safer, it is high maintenance. It does require a high system management. Okay, that in other words, what that basically saying is because of the constant updating of security tabs and the updating of who has access to what information, because people move in and out of an organization, people move up, people move down, people move left, people move right. You have to constantly keep updating that information with regards to who has access to the information. So like I mentioned, the major difference between mandatory access control is classification. And I'm going to give you an example here. So this right here, okay, this right here is basically what would be an example of role based. But within this example, I'm going to add the mandatory access control example. As you can see, you have your people on the left, you have your categories in the middle, and you have your tools on the right. Okay, let's just imagine, let's assume that this information right here in the middle, these roles, these categories, these groups were completely removed. That would mean that everybody on the left would have access to all of these tools here on the right if we didn't have a role-based access control. Okay, if you have access to the network, that means everything on the network would be available to you. In order for us to protect our information and our data, and in order for us to be more secure, role-based access control is one way to implement protection of data. So, for example, if you are in the sales role, you don't need to have information what's going on in Linux. So, role-based access control operates in the idea of least privilege. Where mandatory access control becomes more stricter is you have a category within the category. So as you can see here, we have four categories. We take our people on the left, we decide what role they would fit in. Based upon that role, we decide what tools they would have access to. Hence, with the tools comes the data, so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to mandatory access control, let's assume we have Jane, who is a sales associate, and we have Laura, who's a sales associate. If Jane has 12 years of experience as a sales associate and Laura has 1 day, say it's her first day on the job as a sales associate, mandatory access control can start to classify certain data, in this case, customer base, where they would only have access to certain database or aka customers within their own category. So even though they're part of the sales role, even though they're both part of the sales role, the classification of that data, okay, can go ahead and be divided based upon high, medium, or low. So if you have your high-end clients and you don't want your high-end clients to be bothered by somebody who's their first day on the job, you can go ahead and implement that classification with mandatory access control. Even though Laura and Jane are still on the same role as a sales role, the classification of that data can go ahead and be further divided. That way, you can have your high end clients dealing with your more experienced, seasoned sales associates compared to an associate who is their first day on the job. So, that's where mandatory access control is the major difference between role based access control. Mandatory access control does have what would be category based, which is basically similar to what would be role based. And it does have the major difference of classification, the category within the category of that data, where you can further divide things and make it more appropriate to the individual who is essentially harnessing, gathering the data. Hopefully that helps with the difference between mandatory access control and role-based access control. And we'll see you guys on the next one.